we're just about to pull this semester to a close. Today what we want to do is finish talking about the stage of late adulthood. We've been talking about the last couple of sessions looking at the developmental domain of social development. We left off last time, we had talked about the fact that older adults, often aging parents, often live by at least one other adult child, and that relationship tends to be very close with frequent contact. We had just 2 or 3 points left that we didn't get to last time. We want to finish that up during this session. One of probably the myths or misnomers about late adulthood is that older adults need a lot of assistance. And that tends not to be true when we look at that stage throughout that whole time period from 65 into, again, the late adult stage into the 90s for those that live that long. Obviously, clearly, the need for assistance will increase with age. But most older adults are able to live independently for much of their lives, and even into late adulthood, still will often only need minimal assistance until maybe just the later stage of their life. My mother, who's 70, lives virtually totally independent. Clearly, she needs more assistance than she has needed in the past, but often that's very, very minimal. She has some difficulty with balance, and so there's some times when anything that requires a ladder may need some assistance with, screwing in light bulbs and doing some minor repair things around the house, is unable to do yard work. But in terms of day-to-day functioning, she is very capable of handling her activities. The only other assistance that she really doesn't require, but often will ask, is for advice. And so we'll often have conversations and discussions about how she might handle a particular situation, many times dealing with financial matters since my dad passed away a couple of years ago. But I've known many older adults, even those that are even well into their 90s, clearly where we would think the need for assistance would increase drastically, often still live very independently, still needing fairly minimal help. Again, maybe with more physical kinds of activities, things that they're unable to lift. I know of one older adult until just recently lived independently, and she was legally blind. Clearly she didn't drive. She needed assistance getting places, needed some assistance with shopping, but in terms of day-to-day living and taking care of herself, she was still very capable, like I said, until just recently. So again, it's kind of a myth to think that most older adults need lots of help and assistance. It doesn't seem to be the case. We talked about relationships between adult children and their aging parents. As we've talked about throughout this semester, another critical relationship throughout our lives are our friendships. And friendships play a very vital role in the life of older adults as well. I think one thing that's real important, like we had said, even back in the stage of adolescence, is even though friendships are important and they play an important role, family still remains and continues to remain the primary source of emotional support. Even though more time may be spent with friends, that emotional support still tends to come from family members. Now, one thing that may be surprising as we think about friendships and the relationship with families is that most older adults do have close friendships, not a big surprise, but that they enjoy time more with them than with families. And as I said, that may initially seem somewhat surprising, but I think when you begin to think about it, and maybe in some cases, unfortunately, when you think about how the majority of time is spent between often family members and, again, older adults, and in some cases I have to admit that I'm guilty of this myself, that a lot of it does tend to be more related to providing that minimal assistance that needs to be there, even that much of the conversation that takes place tends to center around addressing issues, seeking advice, talking about things that need to be done, and helping out with those, and that when it comes to who older adults spend time with in terms of enjoyable activities, going to a movie, going out to eat, those tend to be spent with friendships, time that's spent in terms of engaging in those retirement age hobbies and activities, playing cards, a round of golf, again, tend to be time spent more with friends. And again, not mistakenly, don't want to suggest that time spent with family is an important time and that it is an enjoyable time, but maybe isn't still that recreational fun time that tends to be spent more so, again, with friends. And so, again, family provides and will always seem to provide the greatest amount of emotional support. but friends tend to be who older adults tend to enjoy spending time with the most. As we bring this stage kind of to a close, and we think about, as we said at the very beginning of this stage, looking at late adulthood, and we begin to focus more specifically on the aging process, that natural human condition of decline in various types of functioning. We see kind of a slowing down process. One of the things that we said at the very beginning to keep in mind is that there was great variability in those changes. And so, looking at some of the studies that have been done in the recent years, and fairly extensive studies, have tried to understand to some extent what contributes to that variability. And one of the concepts or terms that often gets utilized is what we call successful aging, and that there are certain factors that seem to contribute to minimizing some of that decline, and not just in terms of factors that may contribute to increased longevity of life, but also factors that impact and enhance the quality of life during the later years. And there have probably been 7 key factors, and there are probably more than that, but the 7 key factors that seem to be identified most frequently tend to be common sense. And they're actually, for the most part, lifestyle issues that we begin to talk about even when we were looking at young adulthood. And I just want to kind of review those quickly with you, because again, I think it reinforces that success in life and quality of life is really about lifestyle choices that we make early in our life, and if we'll maintain those lifestyle choices and decision and commitment to that, that we can not only increase the number of years that we live, but more importantly, the quality of our life throughout our lives, and particularly in the later years. The first one, and again, not a big surprise, and we've seen this reinforced even going back to the childhood stages, is the importance of a healthy diet. We know that what we eat is important. Sometimes we know what we should eat and the importance of that, but it doesn't always mean as a society and individually we practice that really well. But we do know that diet, particularly in the later years, can have a tremendous impact on reducing the risk of a variety of different illnesses and diseases. We know that it can help us control weight gain as metabolism begins to change as we age, and to keep that under control, knowing that that also can reduce risk factors of high blood pressure, diabetes, increased risk of heart diseases. We also know that not apart even from the reduction of illnesses and diseases, but what we eat can influence how we feel, can influence our energy levels. And again, I don't think anyone would argue the importance of having a healthy diet in terms of the quality of our life overall. And the second factor, again, which is not a big surprise, I don't think, that we've reinforced continually throughout the semester, is the importance of regular physical activity and exercise. And we again know that it's one of the ways, not only in terms of controlling weight gain, which can have a tremendous impact again on reducing the risk of illnesses and diseases, again, such as heart disease, high blood pressure, but it can be a way of reducing stresses that may be occurred related to other health factors during later adulthood. We know that when we're able to stay physically active, we simply feel better. And that affects our emotional mood, how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about life, and also contributes to how we relate to other people in our lives. One of the things that we said at the very beginning of the semester, and I think these factors reinforce that, is the interplay between the developmental domains. Throughout the semester and the weeks that we've been together and talking about the different stages of life, we've talked about physical development, social, emotional, and cognitive development, and we've talked about how we've tended to look at them often individually, but always want to keep in mind how they function and interplay together, and one impacts the other. We know that when we're eating right, that tends to affect our physical health. Our physical health allows us to be more physically active. That allows us to have a more consistent and regular interaction with other individuals. That affects not only our emotional mood and self-concept and feelings of satisfaction in life, but also has an impact as well in our mental processing of life. And so they all come into play together. And so when adults are able to maintain physical health, and particularly be engaged in physical activity and to be mobile, it's going to impact every other area of their lives. Unfortunately, what happens with some older adults is because of, again, often physical conditions, ailing joints, discomfort in physical activity and mobility tend to begin to become more sedentary, less physical active. And again, what that's going to do is increase those physical declines. In some cases to the point where I don't feel like getting out, it hurts too much to move, and so then I stay inside. Again, as I said, begins to reduce my physical capacities, causes quicker decline in strength and endurance, but then also begins to affect my social interactions. You know, unless I got a strong support network that's coming to see me and spend time with me, I begin to lose contact with others. I begin to feel more lonely, feel somewhat more isolated. That begins to maybe increase levels of depression, which then begins to impact not only how I feel towards life, about life, but even about myself. And it begins to have that cyclical kind of effect. And so again, one of the real critical kinds of factors is being able to physically stay active and be active in life. A third factor, and we just really finished talking a good deal about the importance of that, is having a strong social support system. And ironically, as we go back and at the very beginning of this course, when we were looking at even infant development, and we talked about the criticalness of attachment and how important it is to be connected and to build that sense of trust with others in our lives, how important a human need that is. And I think sometimes we fail to realize not only the criticalness of the importance of being connected and to be able to trust others and to experience that love and that support, but that it's probably a life-sustaining factor as well. And I think this becomes even more evident, again, in the later stages of life. Adults clearly who maintain strong connections with families and friends and are continuing able to maintain those attachments and those bonds, to feel that support of loving and caring and others that they can trust, becomes vitally important. And then as older adults begin to lose that network, and particularly if they're not replaced by others, I've seen in some cases where literally some adults, particularly when, say, they've lost that last significant person in their lives, literally begin to lose a sense of purpose and a will to live. And how that feeling of loneliness, the depression can come from that, can clearly increase the risk of illnesses and disease, and literally can be life-threatening. Not directly from that, but certainly contributing to that. So healthy diet is important. Regular physical activity is important. Strong social support system is important. Fourth factor, again, not surprising, is that it's important, and I think this is true throughout our lives, is that older adults have meaningful and purposeful activities to be engaged in. We need a reason to get up in the day, in the morning. And it's those activities that give us not only a reason for living, but it's what gives our life not only meaning, but enjoyment and satisfaction. And when you look at successful older adults who are still enjoying life, most of the time what they talk about their families, they talk about their friends, typically able to hopefully talk about good health, and because of the good health and those strong social networks, are then able to engage in those activities that they enjoy doing. And we want to continue doing those just as long as we possibly can, because again, it is what brings satisfaction. For a lot of older adults, sometimes we think of retirement as a negative thing. We've talked about retirement already, but for a lot of older adults, it is that retirement period of life where we're actually able to spend more time engaging in those things that we most enjoy doing, that does bring meaning and purpose to our lives, and there's great variation in what those are for different individuals. For a lot of older adults, it's traveling, it's seeing the world. It's going to states or countries that they've always wanted to do and simply maybe didn't have the financial resources or the time to do that, and now here's a way to have those kinds of experiences. For some, it's just an opportunity to engage in those kinds of hobbies, either that they've always had but only were able to do sparingly, or to take on new hobbies. Recently I've taken up golf and have enjoyed the game of golf. Not very good at it. But it is one of those things I've taken up because my hope is and my belief is that it's one of the things that, regardless of maybe some declines that I've had that I've mentioned earlier in terms of knees and back and hips and some of those kinds of things, that hopefully I'll be able to continue well into my later years, whereas some of the other more aerobic, strenuous kinds of things, I anticipate that I'm going to be able to do less and less. I hope to continue to be able to snow ski well into later adulthood. I know of some older adults that spend many days out of the week engaged in playing cards and literally have clubs that they consistently play cards with. I like to tinker in the yard, take on little projects and in terms of fixing things up that simply don't have time for in a busy, hectic life that is currently taking place. And so again, it's important, whatever that would be. I've known a number of older adults that have taken on new hobbies, new activities that they've always wanted to take up. It could be something as basic or simple as learning to play an instrument. I've known some that have taken up creative activities of art, drawing, carving in later adulthood. I mentioned earlier that my dad had taken up massage therapy in later stages. So again, the important thing is that there are those activities that are fun and enjoyable and meaningful and purposeful. Some may be to get involved and engaged in politics or social events, or more involved or engaged in activities at the church that maybe haven't had time for previously, or a social club in the community, or to get involved in Habitat for Humanity or some social causes. Again, the important thing is that my life still has meaning, purpose, that I'm able to still contribute to something. And that seems to be very, very important. The fifth factor has to do with, and we talked about this earlier when we were talking about cognitive development during this stage and the importance keeping the mind sharp. And ironically, and maybe not so, that we find it's interesting that keeping mental capacity sharp and strong and the things that we do to enhance our mental capacity also seems to contribute to physical activity. And I'm not sure that I know exactly all the reasons that is, but I think it's related to that interplay that takes place. But it's real important that older adults, again, not only be involved in physical kind of activities, but also be involved in mental activities as well. And earlier, in one of the previous sessions, we gave a number of examples of that, and just to kind of reinforce some of those. And we clearly know the difference. And we know the difference of older adults who are involved in a variety of different activities that stimulate the mind, thinking, memory. And we know others who tend to be much more passive and sedentary, not only in their physical activities, but sometimes in their mental activities as well. And so those activities can range from stimulating conversation. My wife loves to read, and I anticipate in her later stages of life, reading will be an important part of her mental activities. My mother-in-law, as I mentioned earlier, is real involved in crossword puzzles. I know of a number of adults who enjoy many of the TV game shows, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune. There's some brand new ones that are emerging. Again, that you play along as you watch, and again, it's still causing that mental stimulation that continues to enhance brain development, even into again those later stages of life. And so again, there's a number of activities. Some are later adults. It's not surprising even here on campus to see adults in their 60s and 70s who are taking a college course, older adults who may take a continuing education course or a class in the community, or the number of adults who are becoming interested in the computer and then learning how to use computer skills. And so again, there are lots of opportunities to keep the mental processes sharp in developing. A sixth factor is one, again, it may be a term that you're not real familiar with or heard a lot, is what we call self-efficacy. And again, it becomes, I think, a critical factor, particularly, and I think it's one true throughout our lives, but becomes importantly critical, I think, during the later stages, is that simple or that basic belief that I can handle things. And it becomes real important for older adults, and again, the more older adults believe that, I know I'm getting older, I know there's some decline in functioning, I know that there's an increased need at times for assistance, but there's still that basic fundamental belief that I am still dealing with life, I'm coping with life, I can handle what life brings to me, and that I'm still in control, and that I have not become overly dependent on others. And again, we talked earlier about the importance of older adults remaining independent, and this is not just a matter of feeling independent in terms of daily living, but is that basic internal message, that internal belief that I'm still capable of handling my life, making good choices in decisions, and again, that I'm in control. The final factor, and the one that may seem somewhat maybe surprising, is that we see a strong link between the level of a person's education, particularly in terms of mental capacities, but also in terms of overall successful aging in terms of quality of life. And that increased level of education probably contributes in a lot of different ways. On a basic way, we know that there tends to be a pretty strong relationship between education level and socioeconomic status. And so typically people who have higher levels of education often have higher family incomes. Higher family incomes provide greater opportunities, greater resources, greater knowledge of and access to health care facilities. And so that's probably going to contribute to some extent to successful aging. But apart from that, it may also be that for those that have higher level of education and have pursued more education, may simply be that delight for learning and the quest for knowing. And it may be, that desire simply to continue to learn, to be stimulated by new experiences that simply, regardless throughout their lives, not necessarily for a motivation related to career or increased financial success, but just sheerly from that enjoyment of learning and knowing and gaining additional knowledge that obviously is going to continue to promote cognitive development and mental processes. So, successful aging in terms of enhancing not only longevity of life, but the quality of life. What seems to be important throughout our lives is healthy diet, regular physical activity, maintaining strong social support network, being engaged in meaningful, purposeful activities, engage in those activities that keeps our mind sharp and working, an internal belief that we are capable of handling life, and then continuing to be engaged, not necessarily in a formal process, but always to continue to be engaged in learning and in education. And I think if we apply those basic principles and concepts throughout our lives, that not only in the later stages of life will it enhance our development, but also the quality of our life throughout our lives, if we see that more as a lifestyle, kind of issue. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of late adulthood. Again, as we've done with all the stages, we've looked at social, emotional, social, and cognitive kinds of changes. And it would seem to reason that we've come to the end of the class, because I think a lot of times we tend to think of late adulthood as the final stage, but it's not. We move into the final stage, and I know it seems somewhat, in some cases, feels somewhat depressing to end the semester talking about death and dying. But death and dying actually does represent the final stage of the life cycle. I think we live in a society where the topic of death and dying, and very likely for many of you, is another one of those taboo topics. It's one of those that we'd rather not mention, rather not talk about, even though there's a part of us that knows that it's a part of life, that we simply don't want to talk about it, face it, deal with it, until it becomes a reality in our lives. And I think that tends to often be the case for this class as well. It'd be very easy to end on the note of successful aging. But unfortunately, I think it is important that we talk about it. And so why? Why talk about death and dying? Why talk about that as the final life stage? And I think there are two or three really important reasons. The first one, I think, has to do with the reality, the inevitableness of it. There was a period of time when we go back to the pioneer days and earlier centuries where death and dying was so much a part of life that it was expected because it occurred so frequently and occurred at virtually any age and any stage. In our time, we tend to anticipate that death and dying is going to occur sometime, and hopefully does, in late adulthood. We tend to don't think about it occurs less frequently to younger people. Though we know that it can and it does, but not near in the rate of frequency that occurred hundreds of years ago. But nonetheless, I think it's important that we talk about it simply because it is a reality of life. We've talked about at the beginning of the course the mystery of life, but the other reality is that all of us will face and deal with the final stage, and that is our death. And I think, like everything else that we've tried to talk about in this, the reason why we look at each following stage is that we have some understanding of that stage so that we're more prepared to face it and deal with it successfully. And I think the stage of death and dying is no different. As I've mentioned a couple of times, I know that it tends to be one of those subjects we don't want to talk about, but as a society we tend to be unprepared, or less prepared than we maybe need to be, not only in terms of dealing with our own, but dealing with the loss of loved ones in our lives. So again, one of the reasons I think we talk about that and we deal with that is that inevitable reality in terms of dealing with our own death, but also in terms of dealing with the death and the loss of those that we're really close to. I've been fortunate in my own personal life up until the last 3 years where I really had never lost anyone really close to me. I had dealt with the loss and death of other families dealing with the loss of family members, but to some extent was still somewhat removed emotionally from those losses. Again, they're individuals that I knew, they're families that I was close to, but it wasn't a personal family member that I had a long history of built-up attachment and connection and bonding with. And so probably like many of you, it was something I never really thought much about dealing with, and figured, well, that's something that's a part of my life way, way down the road. 3 years ago, I lost my younger sister to cancer, kind of unexpectedly when that came on. And then a year later, I lost my dad to cancer. And probably those two experiences taught me about a third reason. I think in dealing with the loss of those two family members taught me about the importance of how to be prepared to deal with the loss of a family member, of which I don't think I was well prepared or thought much about. Because again, they came on fairly suddenly. The process happened fairly quickly. And in the midst of dealing with those emotions, there wasn't a lot of time to prepare. And like I said, not a lot of thought and preparation before that. But I think a third reason that I've learned in those two experiences about why we need to talk about death and dying is not only the need to prepare to deal with our own at that point when we're faced with that, or the ability or preparation to deal with the loss of family members or other loved ones that we're close to, be that friends. But what I've learned is the importance of dealing with and understanding death and dying in terms of what it teaches us about living. And I think that may be one of the most important things that I've learned, that maybe to talk about and deal with death and dying doesn't need to be maybe as depressing or as scary or as negative, as much as an understanding of that can teach us about how we need to live. As I mentioned, I lost my dad a couple of years ago, and I remember very vividly, I was on campus, I was in my office, and I remember my dad had gone in just for a checkup for some difficulty he was having. In no way were we anticipating anything that was overly serious, and I remember getting the phone call to come to the hospital, and there were some things that they needed to talk to me about. And it was kind of interesting, and I know most of you are familiar with the song, which has now been around for a good bit of time, but that song was first played on the radio, Tim McGraw's song, Live Like You Knew You Were Dying. It was just first heard during that period of time when I was dealing with the news of my dad, when we came in and they told me that basically he had inoperable cancer, and they were anticipating they maybe had about 6 months to live, and turned out to be more like 6 weeks. And so again, a very short period of time. I began to understand this in dealing with the loss of my sister a year earlier, but I think some of the things that stood out in my mind was my dad. I remember in terms of how he faced his own death and how he faced it with such dignity and such courage that I was really overwhelmed and impressed by that. Later on, we'll talk some about the stages that people typically go through in dealing with their own death, and my dad in some ways seemed to bypass a couple of those stages and really moved much more directly forward to facing it and dealing with it pretty directly. And I was astounded by his ability in facing what would have, for me, been fear and uncertainty, much more concern for those others around him. But my dad said one or two things that will always stick out in my mind, I think, the rest of my life. And one of the things he said is, you never know what hand life is going to deal you. And when it does, you just got to play it out the best you can. And the other thing he said is, and this is what he was talking about, what he learned, is, we all anticipate that we're going to live a long life, but we never know. And he said, you got to do what you need to do, say what you need to say, and don't wait, because you never know. And I think the message I got from that was the same message I began to get from that song as I began to hear it played over and over again on the radio, and still hear it played on the radio to this day, is that, we anticipate that experience is going to occur, and we hope that it's going to occur in late adulthood, but we don't always know. And I don't think we live with the fear of death, and we sure don't ever anticipate that it's going to happen to children or to young adults, but sometimes it does. And so we need to not live in fear of death and dying, but we need to live in the awareness and the reality of that and the uncertainty of that, and so that we don't take life for granted, and that we value each day of our lives, and we live each day to the fullest, and that we do the things that we need to do, not just in late adulthood, but throughout our lives. And we do those things that are most meaningful and purposeful to us, and that we forever cherish those relationships that we value and keep those strong and healthy. And I think that's part of what I begin to learn from dealing with death and dying, in the last, 2 or 3 years. And so I think it's about the importance of talking about it that we're going to do the remainder of this session and throughout the next session, is understanding some of the issues, hopefully being better prepared to deal with the loss of our loved ones, and understand what's happening in the process that we're going through, and then at the same time being able to, in positive, healthy ways, begin to face and deal with our own death when that time comes. As an introduction, there are 4 terms that we simply need to be familiar with. I just simply at this point want to introduce those terms, and then in the next session we'll look at some of the processes in more detail. One of those terms is bereavement. I don't know that it's a term we probably frequently use. It sometimes, I think, gets used interchangeably with grief, and clearly grief is a part of bereavement. But bereavement is simply defined as the loss of someone to whom a person feels close in the process of adjustment to that loss. And so we often talk about the bereaved and what the bereaved person is going through. And so when we think about bereavement, we want to think about that in terms of that total adjustment process that occurs when a person loses someone that they are close to and attached to. Now, in here, we'll talk more about grief. And like I said, the next session will actually kind of look at the steps and processes that an individual goes through in regards to grief. But grief is the emotional response experienced in the early phases of bereavement. So again, when we think about grief, and we talk about someone who's grieving, we're talking about the emotional response experienced as a part of that early process or that early adjustment that we refer to as bereavement. And again, as I said, later on we'll look more specifically, but again, in general, we're talking about that experience of sadness, that experience of disorientation that often occurs, in many cases a sense of denial early on, and then we'll look at the stages that people go through as they begin to process through and work through that emotional, almost roller coaster ride to getting to back to the point where people are able to re-engage in more daily functioning. So bereavement is the loss of someone to whom a person feels close. Grief is the emotional response experienced in the early phases of bereavement. There's also anticipatory grief. Those are symptoms of grief experienced while the person is still living. And many individuals will actually, again, we don't talk about it in here in great detail, but then again, there are a lot of circumstances that result in the loss of someone. In the case of my dad and my sister, there was also the anticipatory grief because, again, we knew of the illness, we knew of the likelihood that sometime within the next few months that death was most likely going to occur. And so there was the knowledge of and the awareness of the loss that was going to take place in dealing with that even before death actually occurred. And a lot of people will talk about, in some ways that's helpful, and there are some positives to having that time period to be able to say some of the things you need to say. and deal maybe with some unresolved issues that hadn't been resolved earlier in life, and that there is some period of time of preparation, for when that loss, that actual death does occur. And I would say that that's true. But again, still that awareness brings about some of those same similar emotional kinds of responses, the sadness, the denial, the anger that this is happening, particularly the anger that there's nothing that you can do sometimes to prevent it or to change it, no matter how much hope you keep and how much faith that you may have in that situation. And then what often occurs is that individuals will deal with that anticipatory grief, and then once death does occur, then they go through another grieving process as well. And then final term is what we call mourning. It's the ways, usually culturally accepted, in which the bereaved and the community act while adjusting to a death. Like I said, they're usually culturally accepted. Some cultures, it's very specific. People know them very clearly. In other cultures, and maybe in the predominant culture of our society, there are certain things we simply practice because it's what we've always seen and maybe really never thought much of them. But they are those certain expectations that we have in terms of how we deal with someone's loss. And again, they're not universal. But typically when someone has passed away or someone's lost something, we obviously expect sadness. We don't expect someone to exhibit a great deal of joy and jubilance at the loss of someone. And so it is that sadness, it is that despair that tends to be a typical kind of reaction. If someone has lost a spouse or a partner, there tends to be a period of time of where there's a clear expectation that they wouldn't begin to engage in new relationships until they've kind of gone through that grieving process. And again, in some cultures, it's a very specific time period. In our culture, there's not a specific time period that's identified, but there's an expectation that if that occurs very soon, very early on, that it's not what would be socially accepted. We have a lot of kind of cultural expectations, and they'll vary greatly by different religions and different faiths, even different denominations, around funerals and how they should be conducted and how you act at a funeral in that process, and particularly in terms of what you wear. Within the denomination that I'm a part of and associated with, funerals are seen as a celebration of one's life. Many of the funerals I've gone to would be hard-pressed to see them as a celebration. But they clearly do tend to depict the anticipation and the expectations of how people should act when they gather together as a community or as a body to remember the person who's passed away. There's a part of me that would like to go against that somewhat cultural, social norm in some ways, and really would like to see my funeral as truly a celebration of my life, and would really like to see my funeral or perceive my funeral to be much more of a celebration, much more of as a party. But as I've talked with others, and particularly my wife, I've come to realize that though that may be my wish, and that they will surely try to honor my wishes as much as possible, that what I may desire and want really falls out of the norm of what tends to be culturally accepted and might be very difficult for others to do at the time when they're dealing with their grief and their processing of bereavement. So we have bereavement, grief, anticipatory grief, and the process of mourning. During the next session, what we'll do is begin to take a look at how we tend to view and see death at different stages of the life cycle. And then, as I said, we'll kind of take a look at the steps of the grief process, and then look at the steps that people who are facing their own death tend to go through. And then we'll kind of summarize and kind of pull this course to a conclusion.